We'll start right here, and this is, just a conversation I want to have. You know what that is? What is that? Huh? Yeah, that's okay. Just pause for a second. It's an engine. It's an exploded view engine diagram, where you see every single part of the engine pulled apart from all its other parts. It's a machine. That's all it is. And every part interacts with some other part. In some cases, a part will interact with more than one other part. Could you study that picture long enough to understand what every single piece, how it articulates with every other piece? Possibly. And there are probably a couple hundred moving parts in that. I'm going to tell you that this is no less a machine than that. Except this one might have millions of moving parts. So when we say, well, if you study an ecosystem closely enough, you should know what the keystone species are before you kill the last one. It's an incredibly complicated machine. And it's really hard to tell how every moving part affects every other moving part. What does this machine do? It moves nutrients around. Nitrogen and carbon, it moves water around. That's what this whole ecosystem thing does. It moves atoms of elements around. So with that, I'll let you pause and go take the nitrogen cycle recall quiz, and then we'll come back to this. So this machine, this forest machine, this planet machine, moves stuff around, and it moves carbon and nitrogen and water. So first question, where is most nitrogen on Earth or near Earth found? It's in the atmosphere. You're breathing it right now. The Earth's atmosphere is 70-some% nitrogen. I forget the exact number. It's not really important. But we can't use nitrogen in the form that it exists in the atmosphere. Plants can't use it in that form. So it has to be put into a usable form, and we call that fixation, which most of you got. Most of that processing is done by bacteria, which you knew. And there are some very specific species of bacteria that live in the roots of leguminous plants. So peas and beans and soybeans. That's why we use soybeans in a rotation with corn, because those soybeans have bacteria on their roots that will fix nitrogen into the soil, and corn needs a lot of nitrogen. So you can spray pea all over it, which is the other option. My father always called it liquid sunshine. But you can also plant soybeans in rotation. Nitrogen is in your body and my body and the body of corn and the tree and the possum and the dandelion. And when we die, that nitrogen is released. Free the nitrogen! Again, by bacteria. So those bacteria are really important pieces in this machine, and we might not even know that. And we've really only it's taken us a long time to figure this out. So when we say, well, if you study the ecosystem well enough, we haven't been great at that, honestly. We haven't been great at figuring out what all the moving parts do. So the reason that we have all these moving parts that are connected, when we tug on one thing, it's pulling on everything else. It's all about the relationships, which I know I said, sounds cheesy and bogus and I hate it, but it's true, especially in ecology. So, yesterday we talked about what happens when we remove a species. I want to talk a little bit today about what happens when we add a species. And we're going to talk specifically about non-native species, and we sometimes call them non-native invasives. So a non-native species is introduced to an ecosystem by humans, and sometimes this happens on accident, sometimes it's intentional. We have introduced some species on purpose to great detriment. And this usually throws things off balance. Now, sometimes we get back to balance pretty quickly, but sometimes it takes time. That top picture has two species in it. What's one of them? Bee is not a species? No, it's not. No, it's not a yellow jacket, though that is a species. It is a honeybee. Honeybee is a species, bumblebees are a species, orchard bees are a species, mason bees are a species, bees is a big group of organisms. So are honeybees native to this continent? Maybe it would help if I gave you their whole name, the European honeybee. No, they're not. They were brought here by Europeans and introduced because they counted on them to pollinate their gardens and their crops and their orchards back home. You couldn't get along without them, so they brought them. What they didn't know was that there were lots of native pollinator species already here. So honeybees are great. I love honey. We go to a little local beekeeper down the road from our house. He's wonderful. We go out to see his hives. He's really cool. Honeybees are awesome. They're in trouble, and I'm upset about it. But there was actually already somebody here doing that job when they moved in. And honeybees have actually changed the ecosystem for those native pollinators. Now, like I said, they're really useful. We wouldn't have our crops of almonds and peppers and cucumbers and zucchini and tomatoes without them. But they did displace native species. What are these things on the bottom? What do they look like? Huh? They look like larvae. I'll give you somebody in the other class caught the large sort of group right away. These are from Lake Erie. They look like clams. They're actually a type of mussel, which is very similar to a clam. And these are a striped mussel. Is this ringing any bells yet? They're zebra mussels. They are pointy, razor-sharp little shells that litter all over the beaches on Lake Erie. And they were introduced to the Great Lakes system in the ballast tanks of Russian freighters. So you have an empty ship come over here, and it has to take water on in the Caspian Sea to sit low enough in the water. And then when it gets to port in the U.S., and these were ships that came into port in the, I think, St. Lawrence Seaway, connected to the Great Lakes system, it lets the water out and loads the cargo and then steams back to Europe. Well, unfortunately, in that water were zebra mussels, zebra mussel larvae. And they took to the Great Lakes like a fish to water. And they did really well. They multiplied. And they ended up, by the 70s, they were in Lake Erie. There are a lot of power plants along the shores of Lake Erie that use lake water for cooling. And if you can't get lake water, you get a serious problem. The zebra mussels would completely close off and clog the intakes. Some of the power plants on Lake Erie had to get scuba divers who would go down with like shovels and pry bars and scrape down the intakes. Some of the city water intakes in like Toledo and Cleveland and a lot of little towns along the lake that drink water out of the lake were getting clogged with zebra mussels. Now, they're a filter feeder. They filter stuff out of the water, so the lake did get clearer. There was less sediment suspended in the lake, but they caused some problems. And because they haven't been here all along, nobody knows, like none of the fish species look at them and go, food, the way they might with a native species. It takes time to build those relationships. That's because, well, we're going to talk about why that is. Those relationships are pretty long-term. So it's not just animals that get introduced. Check that out. So, isn't that pretty? There's a problem. That's a plant called purple loosestrife. And it loves marshes, swamps, and wetlands. Does really well in those environments. Unfortunately, in those environments, it crowds out native species. It's an introduced plant from Europe. And prior to the purple loosestrife, there might have been hundreds of species in that marsh. Once the purple loosestrife moves in, it crowds everything else out. Nothing here eats it. Nothing knows that, there's no animal that's been eating purple loosestrife as long as it can remember. So it disrupts the balance. It changes the relationships. And that is because all of this machine, this great giant engine that's moving elements and atoms around the planet, is built on symbiotic relationships. This is really what makes those parts work together. And these are close relationships, often very, very intimate. and they're always between two species. If there's not two species, it's not a symbiotic relationship. We don't have symbiotic relationships within a species. These are also many generational. So these are tens of thousands of generation. Fox looks at mouse and says, because my people have always eaten your people. And the mouse says, this doesn't make me feel any better about it. These are relationships that have, I can say always been. They are relationships that have been for as long as the species have been. Now, that top picture is an ant and an aphid. What is it doing? Huh? No. The ant's licking the aphid's butt. Ew. I figured you'd say that. So aphids are plant suckers. They're like mosquitoes for plants. And they have a little straw-like mouth, just like a mosquito. They pierce plants, and they suck their juices out. So if you get enough aphids on a plant in your garden, it'll kill the plant, because they'll suck it dry. Well, they take the nutrients they need out of that sap, and they condense the rest, and it squirts out these two little sort of spouts on their butt. And it's called honeydew by that point. It's kind of like maple syrup. It's like concentrated plant juice. So, well, not honeydew, melon. And I assume that you're not going around licking aphid butts. Though you could. I mean, you could. Okay, well, only on your second Thursday of every month. So ants have figured out that they can farm aphids. They're little ranchers. And they have little herds of aphids, and they move them to nice plants and let the aphids eat. The aphids get protected. They get to go to the nicest places, and then the ants lick their butts. So it's their milk. They call it milking aphids. These ants are like little cattle farmers with a little dairy herd of aphids, and they're milking the aphids. The aphids get something out of it. The ants get something out of it. It's a good deal for everybody. Protection. I mean, the ants protect them. They keep them safe. They make sure that they take them to nice plants where they can eat. Just like if you've got dairy cattle, you move them to good pasture so that they produce better milk. The ants take the aphids to the best plants, so they produce the best honeydew, so that when they lick their butts, they're getting the best stuff. What about the next one? Is that two species? Of course it is. Anybody name either of those species? And don't you dare say butterfly. Butterfly is not a species.
Monarch.
It's not a monarch, but I appreciate your effort at naming an actual species of butterfly. It's not a monarch. And I always get these two confused. That's a tiger swallowtail. There's tiger swallowtails and zebra swallowtails, and I get them mixed up. One's got a dark background with light stripes, and the other one's light with dark stripes. That's a tiger swallowtail. We have them around here. You'll see them in the summer, called tiger because of the stripes, swallowtail because of these little things. Those are swallowtails. There's a whole bunch of swallowtail butterflies. What's the other species in the picture? Don't you dare say flower. It's okay. You don't have to know it. I don't expect you to be like master gardeners. It's called a purple cone flower, or echinacea. You might have it in your garden at home. I've got some growing on my fence. They're pretty common. They're native to the prairies of the U.S., so these were a native plant in like Kansas and Oklahoma, and we've brought them. We thought they were pretty, and we've planted them all over the place. What's the butterfly getting here? Pollen, getting food. What does the flower get? What does the purple cone flower get? It gets its pollen spread from plant to plant to plant, so it gets fertilized. So the butterfly is basically waiting in sperm and carrying that sperm from plant to plant to plant to fertilize eggs in multiple flowers so they can produce seed. And then we have the one that isn't so like happy fuzzy at the bottom. That's a symbiotic relationship too. It's predation. The zebra's not going to make it out of this alive. But as long as there have been zebras and as long as there have been lions, those two species have been engaged in this dance, this relationship. It's long term. There are 5 major categories of symbiotic relationship. If you want to take a picture of this and fill it in later, that's fine. we're going to talk about the first two today, predation and parasitism, and then you will have a video that gets you information on these three tonight for homework. And then there will be a little recall quiz when you walk in on the competition, mutualism, and commensalism. You've all known what predators are since first grade. My first grader can tell you, oh, that's a predator. You know what this means. I'm not going to waste time teaching you what it is. You know that they capture, kill, and eat their prey. And this is a great control on prey species. Predation is a fantastic limiter on population size in prey species. It's awesome. So when we see numbers of predators go up, numbers of prey species tend to go down, and vice versa. And this is the exact thing that we talked about with the wolves in Yellowstone. When that predator species disappeared, prey species population numbers went through the roof. Now that changed the rest of the ecosystem because there were all kinds of relationships there, many of which we did not know about. So the thing is, predation also is what pushes species to evolve in particular directions. Good predators pass on their genes. Bad predators don't. They don't get enough food. They don't keep their babies alive. Maybe they don't even get enough food to have babies. So every generation has to be a slightly better predator than the generation before it, because every generation of prey is slightly better than the generation of prey behind it. We call this an arms race. One side gets better, the other one gets better. One side gets better, the other one gets better. And we saw this in the evolution of bacteria and antibiotics resistance. But we see the same thing in predator-prey relationships. Faster, stronger, sharper, faster, wilier, better camouflaged. Can anybody see the prey species in that bottom picture? Can you tell? It is. It is. Spoken like somebody who spent time out in a tomato patch. That is a tomato hornworm. And I have seen them decimate a whole row of tomato plants in about an hour's time. They're horrible things. I tried to train my dog to eat them, but she wasn't having any part of it. Oh well. They are literally the exact same color as tomato vines, and they glisten the same way as tomato vines do, and they have little marks on them that look like leaf scars on tomato vines. It's crazy. They look just like a tomato vine. They're really hard to find. You have to look for their poop underneath them. That's how you narrow it down to which plant they're on. And then you can pick them up and smash them with great glee. But they're very well camouflaged. They're really hard to see. Now this is one we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on. I would encourage you to actually take a picture of this. You know what camouflage is. You don't need to write that down. I'm going to flip this pretty quickly, so I would take a picture. Mimicry is the one thing you may or may not be aware of, and that's where something that isn't harmful looks like something that is. Basically, you get picked on less if you look like the tough kid. You don't have to be tough. You just have to look tough. So the viceroy and the monarch are the classic example because monarchs are bitter, and so birds won't eat them. Viceroys are tasty and delicious. Not that I've eaten them myself, I swear. But they look enough like a monarch that birds just avoid them. I tend to avoid anything that looks like it has raisins in it. It's the same principle. If you want to get cookies past me, just put something raisin-like on the top few, and I won't touch any of them. Same thing. It's mimicry. And, of course, like I said, camouflage. The walking stick is a beautiful example of camouflage. We care about the fact that predators can change an ecosystem without killing a single animal because they control through fear. So just having predators in an ecosystem changes the way prey species act, and this is what we saw in Yellowstone. We saw that once the wolves were back, the elk behaved differently. So they didn't spend all their time frolicking along the stream eating willows. They hid up in the woods. So hence there were more willows, more food for beavers, better stream banks, and less silt in the water for the fish. This idea is what we call a trophic cascade. Trophic means it's all about who eats who and what eats what. And they change ecosystems through this idea of trophic cascade, that one species being removed or introduced can have effects up and down and up and down and up and down, because they're all connected in ways we can't even begin to imagine. There's a book I read years ago, I think it was called Brother Coyote. So out west on the big sheep ranches, coyotes, now mind you, these are smaller coyotes. These are eastern or western coyotes. They're much smaller than our eastern coyotes, which are a hybrid wolf-coyote mix. Guy was talking about how all the ranchers around him, they were all sheep ranchers, had huge problems with predation on lambs. So these coyotes wouldn't go after adult sheep, but during lambing season, lambs are easy. Lambs are fairly defenseless. And a lot of the ranchers around him would poison carcasses. So coyotes are also great scavengers. They like eating carcasses, which is great. They clean up the world. So a lot of ranchers would poison carcasses, but coyotes are smart. What does that teach them? Don't eat carcasses. It says, hey, the last coyote that ate a carcass died. I'm not touching that. I'll take a nice fresh lamb. So he decided to try something different on his ranch. And what he started doing was putting all his carcasses out in a designated area. Coyotes came. Coyotes ate carcasses. He had a sheep die in the barn. He didn't bury it. He didn't burn it. He put it out for the coyotes. And people thought he was crazy. You're going to give him a taste for sheep. What are you doing? And he didn't shoot him either. He actually saw a decline in predation on his herd. He saw another important change. So he had horses. This is a big ranch out west, and this was written probably in the 60s or 70s. He was still using horses on a lot of his ranch. There's something that's really dangerous for horses. Gopher holes. Now here we have groundhog holes, which are similarly dangerous. You ever stepped in a hole? It's not fun. For a horse, it usually means a broken leg, and a broken leg for a horse often is a death sentence. So gophers are the bane of existence on these western ranches. Well, the other thing that he saw when he started putting out carcasses specifically for coyotes was a reduction in gopher populations. He saw other improvements in his pasture because the gophers were being held in check, and that changed another species, and that changed another species. That's a trophic cascade. One species' presence or absence or abundance can change things all the way down the line. Have their predators too. The vicious groundhog preying on innocent clover. The fearsome bunny eating dandelions. Those poor defenseless plants. But they're not so defenseless, as a matter of fact. Plants have got defense mechanisms. And if you've ever gone blackberry picking, you know what their defense mechanisms are. They'll shred you. Nobody's going to eat something with tough, leathery leaves and spiny, sharp branches. Those are defense mechanisms every bit as much as camouflage and mimicry. The other big defense mechanism plants have are chemical, and these are secondary compounds. If you've ever gotten poison ivy, you have been the victim of a plant's defense mechanism. Now, there are species that eat poison ivy. Birds eat poison ivy berries by the bucketful. They're not affected by them. Hogs, my cousin swears hogs will eat poison ivy until there's no tomorrow. Goats will eat poison ivy. They're not affected by it. But a lot of species are, and those species tend to avoid it. Tobacco has this crazy chemical called nicotine. And if you chew on tobacco leaves, it'll make your mouth tingle and burn. It's a defense mechanism. A lot of herbivores won't eat tobacco leaves because it makes their mouth numb and burny and tingly and weird. Wild cherries have got cyanide in their leaves and seeds. I can't remember. Okay, you guys would know. Is it cows that are stupid enough to eat wild cherry, or it's horses? Cows. Okay, so you have to watch out for wild cherry in a pasture because if they eat too many of the leaves, especially when they're wilted, they can actually poison themselves. I couldn't remember. Because they'll eat it. Okay, so here's the big question, because we're thinking about how all these things play together in a community. I don't have this slide, I just want you to think about it. What happens when we have non-native plants that displace the plants that those herbivores are used to eating and that those pollinators are used to pollinating? These are all non-natives: Japanese knotweed, purple loosestrife, garlic mustard. These are natives: milkweed and lady slipper. Common names come from, a long history of human interaction with plants. Garlic mustard it's a member of the mustard family. You can eat the leaves, but it actually smells garlicky. Japanese knotweed is an Asian native species, and I don't know what the knot refers to. Milkweed, if you break the stems, there's a milky fluid in them. Lady slipper orchid, if you look real closely, they look like a fancy lady's shoe if you use your imagination. You have to use your imagination. But yeah, the names come from a long history of human interaction with these plants. We have symbiotic relationships too with these plants that we know and that we use. We will start tomorrow with parasitism, and I'll tell you all about why you shouldn't go near small children. Yay! Because they're disgusting, little germ pots. Even if you love them, they're gross. In parasitism, one species is harmed and the other species benefits. They usually aren't killed. Why? Is it to the advantage of the parasite to kill their host? No, they want to keep them alive. Keep milking this for all it's worth.
How about if they get sick?
Sometimes parasites do kill their hosts, but it's generally not sort of intentional. Like with fleas and dogs, fleas can't kill an adult dog, but there have been cases where puppies will get so infested with fleas that they'll die from blood loss. Puppies or kittens. But usually, they're not trying to kill the host. Okay, we will leave off there. Tonight you will have a video. It's a crash course video, so please use the pause and rewind liberally because he's fast. And it's all about community relationships, and we're going to talk about competition, commensalism, and mutualism. And then tomorrow we'll wrap up parasitism and come back to the rest.